Ladies and gentlemen, it is often in the silence between the asking and the answering that our hearts are most tested. And yet, this silence, what we so frequently mislabel as divine absence, is in fact a crucible, a hidden architecture of God's choosing. When we speak of being chosen, we tend to imagine the immediacy of clarity, the swift motion of purpose unfolding. We do not easily associate chosenness with delay, let alone the kind of delay that feels deliberate. But here is the paradox: for those truly chosen, God often waits, and that waiting is not indifference, it is intention. You see, delay is not denial. We repeat that phrase like a mantra, but few of us believe it in the marrow of our souls. The human spirit instinctively distrusts prolonged silence. We want the voice of God to respond as quickly as our prayers rise. We want an immediate echo, something audible, something visible, something that will confirm we are still seen. But God is not performing to calm our panic. He is refining something deeper. We must not confuse God's patience with distance. Time, after all, is not something God is subject to. It is something He uses. What feels like 2 hours of divine withholding is not about God being late. It's about you being early. His silence is not passive. It is not the result of Him turning His face away. Rather, it is the weighty, sacred pause of a God who knows what must be shaped in us before His next word will make any sense at all. Consider the moment between Jesus' baptism and His public ministry. There was the voice of the Father declaring, "This is my beloved Son," and then, driven by the Spirit, Jesus is taken into the wilderness. No fanfare, no audience, no miracles, just time, just testing. A divine pause. Why? Because the declaration of identity is only the beginning. It must be tested, not in triumph, but in silence. That's the pattern of the chosen, called, then quieted. Psychologically, we are conditioned to equate silence with rejection. When someone does not answer, we assume they've lost interest, changed their mind, or dismissed our worth. We project that same insecurity onto God. But the divine mind does not operate under the compulsions of insecurity. His silence is not a withdrawal of love, but a form of it. It stretches the soul beyond surface faith into the raw dimensions of trust, where belief is no longer tethered to sensation. The chosen ones, those God entrusts with something that transcends their personal lives, must become fluent in divine delay. Why? Because the assignment will demand the same kind of endurance the silence taught them. If God answered too quickly, it would confirm the idea that faith must be fed with constant feedback. But faith that is always fed becomes dependent. God does not raise dependence. He forms sons and daughters. And sons and daughters must grow into maturity. There's a deeper layer here. What God is preparing you for is not merely about you receiving instruction. It's about you becoming the kind of person who will not mishandle what is given. If God gives too soon, you will treat the holy as common. You will run with words meant to be walked with. You will announce what should have been incubated. Delay protects the destiny from being contaminated by your impatience. It is not a denial of your calling. It is its protection. We do not like to wait, but those who are chosen must become people who can, because waiting is not inactivity. It is training. It is restraint practiced. It is trust purified. It is the soul expanding to house the weight of glory that is coming. The longer the wait, the more serious the wait. So if God waited 2 hours to say it, know that those 2 hours were not empty. They were sacred, pregnant with a purpose you couldn't yet see, and when He did finally speak, He wasn't catching up. He was finishing something in you. And so I say to the chosen ones who are still watching the clock, still wondering if the silence means they were wrong or forgotten or somehow unworthy, no, you are not being ignored, you are being prepared. The delay is the confirmation that something divine is at stake. God's pause is not a void, It is a voice in disguise. Learn to hear it, and when he finally speaks, may your soul be ready, not just to listen, but to carry what is spoken with the reverence it demands. Before God speaks, he watches. That may sound unsettling, even invasive to our modern sensibilities, but it is, in fact, one of the most tender truths in the experience of the chosen. When we cry out to hear him, to receive instruction or clarity or breakthrough, we must remember that he is not deaf to our voice. He is discerning it, testing its depth, its tone, its source. And in the way, especially that aching wait between desperation and divine response, he is examining what remains unsurrendered, what is still gripping the reins beneath the disguise of prayer. For the chosen, the stillness before a word from God is not a passive space. It is a proving ground, a hidden arena where strength is not measured by action, but by restraint. We imagine that spiritual strength is demonstrated through visible fruit, decisions, declarations, leadership, motion. But in God's economy, strength is often revealed in how we hold still, how we endure the ambiguous silence without letting panic drive us into self-made solutions. This is why stillness is not for the casual believer. Stillness demands the surrender of ego. It requires you to stop performing, even for yourself, to lay down the compulsive need to do something just to feel worthy. It confronts the deepest lie of modern faith, that if God isn't speaking, moving, or manifesting, then we must not be aligned, or worse, not important. But the truth is harsher and more healing. Sometimes the silence is a sign of trust. God is watching how you steward the absence of his voice just as seriously as how you respond when his voice is unmistakably present. We often miss this because we live in a culture that worships immediacy. Feedback loops are instant. Validation is one post away. But the soul does not mature on dopamine. It matures in delay, and in delay the hidden self, the one behind the prayers, behind the proclamations, rises to the surface. The self that negotiates with God, the self that still believes approval must be earned, the self that wants obedience to pay off quickly. God watches this self, not to condemn it, but to crucify it. The testing in stillness exposes what public praise cannot. It reveals whether we are truly submitted or merely compliant, whether we trust him in the dark or only in the clarity of answers. Because what you do when you hear nothing says more about your maturity than how loudly you praise when heaven is speaking, and the chosen cannot afford to carry an untested trust. What they are called to carry in the future will crush any foundation built on sentiment alone. Philosophically speaking, this kind of testing challenges our view of God's love. We think love should feel like relief, but divine love often feels like restraint, like waiting at the edge of the promised thing and hearing nothing. Yet, this is precisely the way love grows us. God is not interested in emotional dependents who can only function when comforted. He is after sons and daughters who can walk through ambiguity without unraveling, who can carry silence without twisting it into suspicion. There's a deep spiritual principle hidden here. If you cannot sit still before God speaks, you will not stand firm once he does, because his words often call you into terrains where there are no road signs, just echoes of what he said in the quiet. And if you did not learn to trust him during the stillness, you will guess him once you're sent. Every promise given must be stewarded by a soul that has learned to obey without needing to understand first. This is why some of the most critical seasons in a chosen one's life feel so unremarkable. No revelations, no burning bushes, just stillness, but in that stillness, something eternal is happening. God is not just observing your choices. He is allowing your spiritual muscles to develop, even tear, so that when his command finally comes, you don't flinch. You move, not because you're motivated, but because you're anchored. And so, if you find yourself in that long pause between prayer and answer, between longing and fulfillment, do not mistake it for divine negligence. God is not ignoring you. He is proving you. He is letting you discover whether your faith is truly in Him or merely in what He gives. And for the chosen, that discovery is not optional. It is essential, because when God does speak, when that long, awaited word arrives, it will not come to congratulate your patience. It will come to commission your readiness. And only those who have stood the test of stillness will be able to carry what He says without collapsing under its weight. So wait well. Watch how you wait, because He's already watching you. When God delays His voice, He doesn't just withhold instruction. He provokes a confrontation. And not with Him, but within ourselves. This is the part few talk about, because it doesn't feel like theology. It feels like disorientation. And yet, it is precisely in those moments of silence that an identity crisis begins to unfold in the hearts of the chosen. God's delay is not just a test of faith. It is a spotlight exposing the scaffolding we have built ourselves, understanding upon. The longer He waits to speak, the louder our inner voices become, and often they don't sound like Him at all. We tend to think that clarity about God will automatically bring clarity about self, and sometimes it does, but often the reverse is true. God holds clarity about the mission because the identity of the messenger is still unstable. And so He waits, not because He is cruel, but because He knows how dangerous it is to send someone who still needs constant affirmation to believe they are chosen. During that long pause, those 2 hours of divine silence, the chosen are not just waiting for a word. They are grappling with the unspoken question, who am I without the voice of God constantly confirming it? That's where the cracks begin to show. We say we trust Him, but what we really trust is the feedback loop. What we feel when He speaks, the affirmation when a door opens, the sense of security when His presence is thick and undeniable. Take that away, and suddenly we wonder if we misheard Him altogether, or worse, if we were never called. Psychologically, this is the space where old scripts return. The voices of our past, the teacher who underestimated us, the parent who ignored us, the culture that dismissed us, begin to fill the silence, and because we haven't learned how to silence them, we start negotiating our identity with them all over again. We begin to shrink ourselves down to what feels manageable, what feels safe. If God hasn't spoken, we reason, maybe we were wrong to hope for more, but the silence isn't sent to crush us. It is sent to reveal where we have built our sense of self on something shakier than God's word. It is a kind of surgery, painful, yes, but necessary, because if we go forward too soon, still tangled in the need to be validated, still haunted by the fear that we are impostors, then the weight of the calling will crush us. Not because the call is too heavy, but because our internal foundation is too weak to carry it. There is something sacred about being left with only yourself. When all divine fireworks fade and there is no applause, no confirmation, no feeling, just you in silence, you are forced to see what's truly there. Many discover in that moment that they never really believed they were chosen. They only believed they were useful, and usefulness is a shaky foundation for identity. Because the moment you feel unproductive, you assume you are unworthy. But chosenness is not a function of usefulness. It is a function of grace. You are not chosen because you perform well. You are chosen because He willed it so. And until that truth moves from your theology into your bones, God will let the silence speak louder than your striving. He will wait, not to shame you, but to mature you. Philosophically, this is the death of the false self, the self we've crafted to please others, to prove we are enough, to outrun the shame of being overlooked. That self cannot inherit a divine calling. That self must be put to rest, and so God waits. He waits until the panic quiets, until the pride breaks, until the orphan inside us finally stops begging for crumbs of attention and begins to believe, deeply, stubbornly, that they are a son or daughter. Not because they heard a new word, but because they survived the silence. It is in that survival, in that stillness, that something sacred is born. Not the calling, that was already settled. What is born is the self who can carry it. The self who no longer needs to be constantly affirmed, who no longer performs for invisible audiences, who can move in faith without a fresh word every morning. The self who, even in the absence of feeling, still knows, I am chosen. So if you're in that place right now, between the cry and the answer, wrestling with who you are when God seems quiet, don't rush to escape it. That discomfort is forming something in you. The silence is stripping away the fragile identities you've gathered until only the truth remains. And that truth is this: God's voice may delay, but His choice does not. You were chosen in the silence, not after it. Believe it, stand in it, and let the crisis become your commissioning. There is something subtle and sinister about the silence before God speaks. We often imagine it as merely a void, an empty pause in communication, but in truth it is a contested space, a battleground. When heaven holds its voice, hell rarely does. In the absence of divine clarity, lies come forward, dressed in logic, wrapped in half-truths, and whispered in tones so familiar they sound like our own inner voice. That is where the chosen are most vulnerable, not in the absence of God's presence, but in the misinterpretation of His silence. The adversary does not need to shout. He only needs a whisper believable enough to fill the gap. And what better time to whisper than when we're already uneasy, already questioning, already tired of waiting? This is why silence is not neutral. It is a pressure chamber where the mind begins to manufacture narratives. Maybe you missed it. Maybe you weren't really called. Maybe God has moved on. Maybe He's disappointed. Maybe you need to take things into your own hands. These thoughts do not arrive like a sledgehammer. They arrive like a suggestion, subtle, almost reasonable. Psychologically, the human mind seeks closure. When something goes unresolved, especially something we care deeply about, we subconsciously try to fill in the blanks. If God hasn't spoken yet, we'll finish the sentence for Him, and more often than not, we finish it in fear. That is the trap of the chosen, to rewrite God's silence into rejection, or worse, abandonment. The enemy's strategy is rarely to deny outright that God exists or speaks. It is to make you question whether He's speaking to you. Because if you can be convinced that God has favorites, and that you are not one of them, then you will begin to shrink your faith into mere maintenance. You'll stop asking bold questions. You'll stop waiting for wild answers. And eventually, you'll stop expecting anything at all. This is not simply a psychological phenomenon. It's a spiritual war of agreement. The enemy cannot curse what God has blessed, but he can trick you into cursing yourself. He can't unchoose you, but he can lure you into disqualifying yourself with your own words, your own doubts, your own quiet withdrawal from the calling you once believed was yours. He can't sever the covenant, but he can manipulate your interpretation of it until you walk away from the very promise God was preparing to fulfill. It's important to understand this because the chosen are often the ones most targeted in silence. Not because they've done something wrong, but because they carry something costly. The more weight your assignment carries, the more deliberate the enemy's interference will be. He is not bothered by the inactive believer, the one content with comfort and vague spirituality. He comes for the ones who are close, close to breakthrough, close to revelation, close to obedience that changes atmospheres, and the primary weapon he uses, misinterpretation. If he can distort how you hear silence, he can change how you hear God. And once that shift occurs, even when God does speak, you will second, guess it, you'll hesitate, you'll wonder if it's just your imagination or some psychological compensation for disappointment. That is why learning to wait in truth is not just a skill, it is warfare. Because waiting in truth requires holding the line against every false narrative that seeks to fill the silence. So what's the counter to this subtle warfare? It is not noise, it is alignment, anchoring yourself in what God already said, even when you don't yet understand what He's about to say. It is disciplining your inner life so that every whisper is filtered through the character of God, not the chaos of your fears. It is choosing to believe, in the absence of feeling, that God is not only still present, but still intentional, and that His silence is not a withdrawal. It is a setup, a holy pause that sharpens your discernment for what's coming next. The most dangerous thing that can happen in a divine delay is not that you lose time. It's that you agree with the wrong voice in the waiting, because the moment you do, you begin to live from a false center. You take action that is subtly off course, and by the time the true word of God comes, you've already rerouted your faith around a lie. So, if you are chosen, and if you are waiting, and if the silence has begun to feel like abandonment, don't ask what God has failed to say. Ask what lie you've started to believe in His absence. Expose it. Reject it, silence it, because the voice of hell only has power when it's mistaken for the voice of reason. But the voice of heaven, when it finally breaks the silence, will always realign you with who you really are and remind you of what never stopped being true. Wait with your ears open but your heart guarded. The silence is holy, but so is your agreement. Choose wisely. When God finally speaks after hours, maybe even years, of silence, He never speaks at random. His words do not come as comfort merely, nor as decoration, nor even as simple answers to our questions. When He breaks the silence, it is always surgical. It is as if the silence had been working like anesthesia, and now, with the scalpel in hand, He utters what will cut away illusions, false identities, and shallow expectations. What He says reveals not only His will, but why He waited. You see, we assume we are waiting for words, but often God is waiting for us, not for us to be perfect, but for us to be ready. Ready to hear the truth in such a way that it does not merely inform our minds, but changes our very trajectory. When God finally speaks, His voice carries a precision that reaches past our intellect and into the fault lines of our soul, and He does not waste His words. If He waited 2 hours to say something, it is because what He is about to say could not have been rightly received 1 minute sooner. There is something profoundly humbling about this. We imagine ourselves prepared the moment we feel desperate. But desperation is not the same as readiness. One may cry out from impatience, from pain, from longing. But God responds when the inner soil is soft enough to absorb rather than resist. And sometimes that requires the silence to stretch. Sometimes only time can do the surgery that prepares the soul to steward a word that would have destroyed us if it came too soon. Psychologically, we tend to think that more information will soothe us. But divine speech is not data. It's direction, and direction, when given to a heart still tangled in pride, fear, or misidentification, becomes dangerous. God speaks when His voice will not simply be heard, but obeyed. Not because He is controlling, but because His words are never trivial. They are always formative. This is where we must examine the difference between information and revelation. Information can be absorbed without transformation. Revelation demands a shift. It draws a line in the sand and says, "Now that you know this, you cannot live the same." And this is why some of us don't hear God as often as we'd like, because we have not yet made peace with the cost of knowing. We want to hear without being held accountable to what's heard, but God does not indulge spiritual curiosity. He entrusts revelation only to those willing to be changed by it. When he finally speaks, what he says is often not what we expected. It may not even feel like an answer to the question we thought we were asking, but it will reach into the core issue, the one we were avoiding, the one we couldn't name. His words arrive with purpose, to confront, to course, correct, to anchor us more deeply in himself. And that is why they come late by our clock, but right on time in his. And let us not forget, when God speaks, it is not always comfort we feel first. Sometimes it's confrontation, sometimes it's conviction. And in that moment, we must decide whether we are mature enough to receive a word that doesn't flatter us, a word that calls us higher, calls us deeper, calls us out of every false construct we built during the silence. That kind of word may feel costly, but it is also liberating. It peels away every lie we agreed with and restores the clarity that silence prepared us to handle. What God finally says is never separate from what the waiting was doing. The silence is not a prelude, it is part of the message. It tills the ground, it breaks up the hardened places, it creates hunger, not for just any answer, but for his answer, and when that answer comes, it doesn't just fill the hunger. It redefines it. It changes what we ask for next. It matures our palate. It quiets our panic. It turns a restless heart into a steady one. So do not underestimate what it means when God finally speaks. That word is sacred, not because it is rare, but because it is timed. It arrives when your soul can carry it without twisting it, when your character can host it without exploiting it, and when your faith can act on it without needing applause. If you've been waiting and the silence has stretched beyond comfort, know this: what he will say when he says it will explain the wait, not in words alone, but in the way it hits your spirit, in the way it lands with a gravity that says, "This was worth it." Wait for that word. Be shaped by the silence so you can carry what is spoken, because what God finally says is not just a message. It is a moment that defines everything that comes next. We often think we're waiting on God, but in truth, God is often waiting on us. Not waiting in the way we understand it, impatiently, anxiously, but waiting as a wise craftsman waits for metal to reach the right temperature before shaping it. The delay is not hesitation on his part. It is preparation on ours. The word he intends to speak is not light. It carries weight, and before that weight is placed upon us, something must be forged within us to carry it well. The pause, then, is not wasted time. It is a shaping time. To say, God waited 2 hours to speak, is, in a way, to misunderstand what those 2 hours were doing. They were not a delay in communication, but a dimension of transformation. Those hours were not for him, they were for you. Because he is not bound by time, he speaks from eternity, yet he knows that you are formed in sequence, in process, in the slow unfolding of minutes that sometimes feel empty, but are, in fact, full of hidden work. God uses time not because he needs it, but because we do. This is one of the great misconceptions in the spiritual life. We imagine that because God is omnipotent, his work should be instant, that he should move the moment we pray, the moment we believe, the moment we cry out. But power does not mean haste. God does not act out of urgency. He acts out of wisdom, and wisdom knows that the vessel must be made ready for what it's meant to hold. Otherwise, the blessing becomes a burden, the calling becomes a collapse, the voice becomes a noise we cannot rightly interpret. What this means, quite profoundly, is that the silence was not a gap. It was grace, grace in disguise, grace with its sleeves rolled up, grace that refused to answer too early, because it knew we'd mishandle what we were not yet matured to carry. The time between the promise and the fulfillment is sacred. It teaches us what no sermon ever could: how to be still without becoming stagnant, how to wait without becoming bitter, how to grow without always feeling progress. This kind of waiting forces the soul to let go of its need for control. And control is, if we're honest, the last thing most of us surrender. We'll give God our praise, our time, even our public obedience, but relinquishing control over the pace, over the process, over how and when the answer comes, that's where the real work is done. That's where the chosen are distinguished from the merely willing. The chosen are not just marked by calling. They are marked by their ability to wait in faith, to suffer delay without distorting their posture. There is a psychological depth to this that's often overlooked. Our identity becomes fragile when we tie it too closely to performance or progress. If God spoke today, many would immediately sprint, execute, build, and in doing so, tether their self-worth to the outcome. But God waits to speak until our inner life has been untangled from such fragile scaffolding. He waits until the soul has become less attached to doing for Him and more attuned to being with Him. Then, and only then, can He speak in such a way that His voice does not compete with our insecurity. Think of it like this: the voice of God is not a decoration to our lives. It's an axis around which everything should revolve. But if our internal world is off kilter, dominated by unhealed wounds, false narratives, or spiritual immaturity, then even a true word from God can be twisted into a burden, and so He waits, not silently as in neglect, but silently as in wisdom. He lets the waiting do its work. He lets the fire of delay burn away the need to be seen, the urge to prove, the subtle idolatry of being needed. And when that work is complete, or even mostly complete, He speaks. And suddenly everything makes sense. What He says is not just about direction. It's a confirmation of what's already been refined. His word doesn't land on raw soil, it lands on ground tilled by time, prepared by trust. And the soul, once impatient and uncertain, now receives it not with panic, but with peace. So if you're waiting, if you've been staring into the silence and wondering when God will speak, consider this: perhaps He's not getting ready to say something. Perhaps you're getting ready to hear it, and that changes everything. It means the silence is not passive, it's participatory, it's shaping you, it's strengthening the foundations that must be laid before anything sacred can be built. So don't despise the stillness, don't rush the process, be faithful in the pause, because the voice that will break it will not just instruct you, it will reveal who you've become, and when it does, you will know. The wait was never about God being late. It was about you becoming able, ready not only to hear but to carry,